When Caitlin Clark's arrival shifted the WNBA's media landscape overnight, it wasn't just about hype, it was data. Sold-out arenas, viral clips, and record-breaking ratings told the story. But instead of embracing this shift, voices like Elle Duncan framed the surge of interest as a problem, not a breakthrough. Her claim that new fans were sucking the life.
If you're here for the real story and not the filtered version, subscribe. And if you're sticking around for the next meltdown, you better definitely subscribe.
Out of the league ran counter to every measurable success the WNBA had achieved that season. What followed wasn't outrage, it was erosion. Public support began to crack, not because fans turned on the league, but because the league seemed to turn on them first. As tensions escalated, fueled by CBA disputes, tone-deaf slogans, and a failed 3-on-3 venture without Clark, Rebecca Lobo stepped in with a rare dose of clarity. Her call for humility and perspective reframed the conversation. Growth demands gratitude, not grievance. Duncan's misstep was more than bad commentary. It was a warning ignored. Elle Duncan probably thought she was dropping a thought-provoking take. Instead, she lit a match and tossed it straight into the heart of the WNBA's biggest growth moment in decades. Her now infamous claim that new fans were sucking the life out of the league landed like a thud across sports media, and the fallout hasn't stopped since. This wasn't just a clumsy opinion. It was a direct slap at the very people who were showing up in record numbers to support women's basketball. People who were finally tuning in, buying jerseys, packing arenas, and shifting the cultural conversation. And yet, according to Duncan, they weren't saving the league. They were somehow draining it. The timing couldn't have been worse. Caitlin Clark had just taken the WNBA to heights it had never seen. Her arrival coincided with a tidal wave of attention. Games sold out. TV ratings surged. Merchandise moved. ESPN, Duncan's own employer, ran more women's basketball segments than it had in years. The sport was everywhere. For once, it wasn't being ignored. And still, Duncan's takeaway was that this influx of support wasn't authentic. That it was hurting the league more than helping. No data, no evidence, just vibes and elitism. But here's what Duncan and those echoing her sentiment failed to grasp. For the better part of 25 years, the WNBA was largely invisible to the average sports viewer. It ran on life support, kept alive by NBA subsidies, media goodwill, and the occasional Olympian name recognition. Attendance was spotty. Coverage was inconsistent. Even hardcore sports fans couldn't name more than a couple of players. Then came Caitlin Clark, and everything changed. Clark wasn't just a great shooter. She was a phenomenon. Her college games were must-watch events. Her move to the WNBA wasn't just a draft pick, it was a cultural moment. She brought fans. She brought ratings. She brought mainstream media coverage, not in a slow trickle, but in a flood. ESPN went from burying WNBA coverage to headlining it. That wasn't coincidence. That was Clark. But instead of embracing the moment, some within the WNBA, and clearly in sports media, chose to push back. Duncan's words were just the loudest signal of a growing resentment. The implication being that Clark's fans weren't real, that they didn't deserve to be here, that maybe their enthusiasm was racially motivated. That talking point gained traction, and it poisoned the well. Longtime supporters, certain players, and media voices began treating Clark's popularity as suspect. They didn't question her talent. They questioned her appeal. And in doing so, they alienated the very people who were investing in the league's future. The consequences hit fast. Off-season projects like Unrivaled, a 3-on-3 women's league created by WNBA star Nafisa Collier, flopped out of the gate. With Clark nowhere near it, national TV broadcast drew just 32,000 viewers per game. That's not a typo. Despite featuring many of the league's top names, the numbers flatlined. Why? Because the average viewer didn't care unless Clark was involved. That's not a knock on the other players. It's a reality check about star power. The uncomfortable truth is that talent doesn't always equal marketability. Plenty of skilled athletes never become household names. But Clark did. And instead of using her spotlight to elevate everyone, The league's public messaging seemed almost embarrassed by her. Instead of building around her, the conversation turned defensive. Clark's success was treated less as a gift and more like a disruption, like she had hacked the system. Which brings us back to Duncan. Her take didn't just miss the mark. It exposed a deeper problem, a mindset that viewed popularity as something that had to be earned a certain way. And if fans didn't check all the right boxes, they were unwelcome. This gatekeeping wasn't just damaging. It was suicidal from a business perspective. The WNBA has always needed fans. It's always needed ratings. It's always needed cultural relevance. That's how leagues grow. That's how athletes get paid more. That's how the entire infrastructure of professional sports evolves. But that only works if you want those new fans. And Duncan, whether she intended to or not, said out loud what too many were already thinking. We don't. Rebecca Lobo, a former player and current ESPN analyst, wasn't having it. She stepped up with a far more grounded message. Lobo, who played during the early days when players barely made a living, pointed out just how far the league had come. Housing stipends, revenue sharing, childcare assistance, modern facilities, higher salaries. These weren't fantasy demands. They were real progress. But players weren't communicating that. At the All-Star game, they wore shirts that said, "Pay us what you owe us." A bold message, but the performance that followed was anything but. The gameplay was slow. Defense was minimal. Effort was clearly lacking. And for fans watching, especially those new to the sport, it sent the wrong message. It made the movement seem performative. Worse, it undermined the player's case. If you're asking for more, fans expect more. That doesn't mean you owe them blood, sweat, and tears every second, but it does mean that public demonstrations have to be backed up with professionalism. And when they're not, the message backfires. Lobo warned that this disconnect between the players' demands and public perception was becoming a real liability. Because instead of sympathy, the players were starting to face skepticism. For the first time in a long time, fans were siding with owners in labor disputes. Not because the owners were right, but because the players had lost the messaging war. That kind of shift is dangerous. When fans feel unappreciated, they walk away. When they're told they're not real fans, they stop showing up. When they're accused of only liking a player for the wrong reasons, they lose the motivation to care. And care is everything. In sports, loyalty can't be mandated. It has to be earned and preserved. That's not a racial issue. That's a marketing issue. The WNBA had momentum. Caitlin Clark was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But instead of recognizing her as a catalyst for long-term growth, some decided she was a symbol of everything wrong with fan culture. And now the numbers are reflecting that miscalculation. Viewership is slipping. Sponsorship interest is cooling. Off-season initiatives are flopping. The CBA negotiations are stalled. And the worst part? The league still hasn't adjusted its strategy. You don't grow by shaming your audience. You don't expand your reach by rejecting the people who show up. Whether they're watching for the first time or the thousandth, they're still watching. And in sports, watching is everything. Elle Duncan didn't just say something controversial. She said something that confirmed the suspicions of new fans who already felt like outsiders. She gave voice to the idea that women's basketball didn't really want them. That if they weren't here from day one, their support didn't count. That mindset will kill the league faster than any failed CBA. The fact is, Caitlin Clark brought visibility, money, and momentum. She didn't ask for special treatment. She just showed up and played. And the market responded. That's not something to apologize for. That's something to build on. The path forward isn't complicated. Embrace star power. Support new fans. Train players and commentators on how to communicate in a way that welcomes rather than alienates. Recognize that sustainable growth comes from inclusion, not exclusion. And above all, stop blaming the people who care. Because at the end of the day, a league lives or dies on the backs of its supporters. And right now, the WNBA is sending mixed signals to the very people who could secure its future. So what do you think? Did Elle Duncan just say what others were too afraid to admit? Or did she completely misread the room? Has the WNBA leaned too far into pride and lost sight of the bigger picture? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this if you've been following the drama. Hit that like button if you think sport commentary needs to be held accountable. And don't forget to subscribe. This story isn't just about one person. It's about the growing pains of an entire league. And this conversation, it's far from over. The Elle Duncan moment didn't just trigger backlash. It exposed fault lines that had been quietly growing under the surface of the WNBA for a long time. You had fans who finally felt welcome, finally felt seen, finally felt like they were part of something exciting. And in one segment, one sentence, Duncan told them, "Actually, you're the problem." Let's be clear, Duncan didn't make her comments in a vacuum. There was already tension around Caitlin Clark's explosion into the spotlight. Some of it was rooted in discomfort with how fast she became the face of the league. Some of it stemmed from frustrations that other players, particularly black women who had carried the WNBA for years, weren't getting the same level of recognition. That's a valid conversation. But what's not valid is weaponizing that frustration to turn away the very people who were finally paying attention. That's what Elle Duncan's comment did. It turned a nuanced issue into a divisive headline. It told new fans they were unwelcome. It did so at the exact moment when the WNBA needed them most. And once that bridge was burned, it was hard to rebuild. You could see the effects everywhere. Comment sections flooded with confused and offended fans. Viewers asking, "Why are we being told we don't belong?" Sports radio lit up with callers who felt blindsided. Some are lifelong women's basketball fans finally seeing their sport get the respect it deserved. Others were newcomers just trying to learn, trying to care. But both groups walked away feeling the same thing, rejected. And when rejection hits fans on an emotional level, they disengage. Quietly, permanently. You don't always get a dramatic exit. Sometimes they just stop showing up, stop watching, stop buying. And that's exactly what happened. Caitlin Clark's name still brought buzz. But outside of her orbit, the energy started fading. The league's summer campaigns weren't sticking. The media coverage cooled. Merchandise numbers slumped. And Unrivaled, despite a polished rollout and media attention, absolutely cratered in ratings. Not because the players weren't talented, but because star power drives everything. And without Clark, the casual viewer tuned out. The real-world impact of Duncan's message, and the larger sentiment behind it, became clearer with each passing month. Momentum stalled. Engagement dropped. And the players? They were still pushing their "pay us what you owe us" campaign, but now the public wasn't buying it. People weren't denying the right to fair pay. They were questioning the approach, the framing, the optics. When players called a generous CBA proposal a slap in the face, it came off less like advocacy and more like entitlement, especially when paired with underwhelming gameplay and combative public statements. Rebecca Lobo wasn't the only one who noticed, but she was one of the few brave enough to say it. Her voice carried weight, not just because she played in the early days of the league, but because she understood the bigger picture. She knew what it looked like when progress was being made but poorly communicated, and she saw how badly the league was failing to read the room. Fans weren't turning on the WNBA because they didn't support women's sports. They were turning away because the relationship felt one-sided. They showed up in good faith, spent money, boosted ratings, and got told they were sucking the life out of the league. They watched high-profile games where effort was questionable. They saw off-court drama prioritized over product. And slowly, that emotional connection started to unravel. Here's the hard truth. No one owes your league attention. No one is required to stick around after being insulted. You can't treat fans like an inconvenience and expect them to stay loyal. Especially not when the league finally had the cultural moment it had been chasing for years. The real heartbreak in all of this? The WNBA had a chance to win everyone over. Clark was the door. She opened it. And instead of walking through, too many chose to slam it shut because they didn't like who else was coming in. It wasn't just about race or legacy or recognition. It was about fear of change, fear of losing control of the narrative. But trying to police who's allowed to care about women's basketball isn't protecting the sport, it's hurting it. The comparisons to other leagues are impossible to ignore. The NBA embraced every single superstar that brought in fans, whether it was Jordan, Iverson, LeBron, or Steph. Each player's unique appeal was used to lift the entire brand. There was no shame in building around stardom. There was no resentment toward new viewers. Growth was the goal. Period. In the WNBA, it feels like the opposite happened. Clark showed up and delivered everything the league had been begging for: visibility, engagement, money. And instead of rallying behind her, the conversation turned hostile. As if the attention she brought was unfair. As if the interest she generated was artificial. As if the fans she attracted weren't worthy. That mindset will ruin everything. Because this wasn't just about one season. This was about the future. About changing the perception of women's sports permanently. About proving there was a market, there was demand, and there was a pathway to sustainable success. But the messaging failed. The PR crumbled, and the fan base fractured. If Elle Duncan's comment was the match, the league's refusal to correct course was the fuel. The WNBA let that narrative spiral out of control. It didn't counter it with inclusion. It didn't amplify voices calling for unity. It just kind of let it hang in the air. Meanwhile, Clark kept doing her thing. Kept playing. Kept showing up. Kept being the draw. All while staying quiet through it all. That silence? It worked in her favor. While others ranted about why she shouldn't be the center of attention, she kept proving exactly why she was. But she can't carry the entire league alone. That was never the point. The opportunity wasn't to make it the Caitlin Clark show. It was to use her as an on-ramp, a starting point, a reason for people to come in, learn more, and stay. Instead, too many people made it a competition, a binary. Either you're for Clark or you're for the league. And the second that framing took hold, the momentum died. So here we are, months removed from the comment that started it all. And the results speak for themselves. The league's off-season engagement is down. Viewership for major broadcasts outside of Clark's games is weak. Collective bargaining negotiations are stuck. Fans are split. And ESPN, the same network that gave Duncan the mic, hasn't offered any kind of public course correction. It's not just a PR failure. It's a leadership vacuum. The lesson couldn't be clearer. Growth doesn't happen by rejecting your supporters. You don't build by gatekeeping. You don't elevate by attacking. You build by inviting people in, showing them why this matters, and making sure they feel appreciated for showing up. Because the moment they feel unwelcome, they'll stop showing up. And right now, the WNBA can't afford that. If the league wants to recover, it needs a reset, a clear, strategic shift in tone. Embrace the fans. Embrace the stars. Embrace the moment. Clark isn't the enemy. She's the gateway. And fans? They're not parasites. They're the lifeline. Sports only grow when there's room for everyone. Not just the day one diehards. Not just the players and media figures who've been in the trenches. Everyone. That includes the dad who watched Clark with his daughter for the first time. The college student who never tuned in before. The casual sports fan flipping channels who stopped and stayed. They all matter. And if the WNBA can't make space for them, it's going to shrink back to the margins it fought so hard to escape. So what's next? That's up to the league, the players, and the voices who shape the narrative moving forward. But if the last few months have proven anything, it's that no amount of talent can survive poor public relations. And no cultural moment is strong enough to overcome resentment from within. And here's the thing. This whole situation didn't have to implode. The WNBA had everything lined up for a breakthrough year. Caitlin Clark brought the buzz. The fans brought the attention. The media had finally cracked open its door to women's basketball in a way that wasn't just symbolic, it was real. But instead of leaning in, instead of turning the spotlight into a platform, too many people with influence try to dim the lights. Let's be honest. When Elle Duncan made her now notorious comment, she wasn't just criticizing casual fans. She was speaking from a perspective that was echoed, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, across the league. It was a kind of protectiveness over the WNBA that looked more like gatekeeping than loyalty. That protectiveness? It became toxic because fans don't want to be tested before they're allowed to care. They want to be welcomed. And the second you start making them prove they belong, most will just walk away. Not out of guilt, but out of annoyance. What Duncan and others misunderstood is that star power isn't a threat to league integrity. It's the engine. Always has been. Always will be. Caitlin Clark wasn't stealing attention. She was creating it. She wasn't pulling oxygen out of the room. She was giving the WNBA the fresh air it needed to breathe in a crowded sports landscape. And what did the league do with that oxygen? It gasped, panicked, and then started coughing up PR disasters. Unrivaled flopped because it couldn't hold attention without her. The CBA talks are stalled because the league lost narrative control. And even the All-Star game, meant to be a celebration, turned into an unforced error. Players wore political slogans but didn't bring their A game. The message may have been valid, but the execution? Weak. You can't demand investment from fans and then act like the moment doesn't matter, especially when you're already fighting to prove the product deserves more. And through all this, no one, not ESPN, not league officials, not the high-profile players doubling down on the anti-Clark sentiment, bothered to say, maybe we got this one wrong. Rebecca Lobo stood out precisely because she did. She didn't sugarcoat the problems, but she also didn't take the easy route of blaming fans or blaming Clark. She reminded everyone where the league started and why this moment, flawed as it may be, is still progress. That's the voice the WNBA needed more of. Not the voices dividing fans into real and fake. Not the ones acting like new attention was a threat instead of gift. Because if the WNBA wants to become more than a niche league, if it wants staying power, it has to realize something fundamental. You do not grow by shrinking your circle. You grow by opening the door wider, by building bridges, not barriers, by recognizing that someone who only just discovered the league today might become a lifelong fan tomorrow, if you let them. So where do things stand now? The dust has settled, but the damage lingers. The numbers are down. The hype has cooled. And the fans? Many are still watching, but they're watching carefully. They're waiting to see if the league wants them back, or if they're going to be told once again that their support is somehow wrong. That's the part people will remember. Not the hot takes, not the slogans, not the spin, but how the league treated the people who tried to care. So what's your take? Did Elle Duncan's comments just expose what others were already thinking? Or did she single-handedly drive away the very audience the WNBA needed most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you're still rooting for women's sports to get the respect and the strategy it deserves. And don't forget to subscribe. This conversation isn't over. And the next misstep, it's already loading.